Perfect. All right. So here goes the live demo. We'll see if this works. So currently, login for TriNetX requires a BMC username and password because we use the ADS login credentials from BMC. It is possible to use other systems, and so you know, I think the BMC legal folks are working through how to, for example, be able to use Kerbos from BU to log in, and so that's definitely feasible. So there won't be a new username and password is the bottom line for the system. And I just log in with my BMC username and password. And you can see that same thing. Since I'm an administrator, my studies are pretty much every invitation that we've had. But today I wanted to just mostly focus on some simple queries. So the first one I could just do for you in pretty real time is a simple diabetes query. So if we just wanted to do diabetes, you get these pretty easy to navigate lists. There's a lot of options though. So right away, you can kind of see the complexity of the data that's underneath here, but this is what is in the actual Epic EHR. And so generally it's a hierarchical approach with the most patients being at the top. So the most inclusive thing would be here, but not always. So depending on what you see here, some are under that category and some are not. So the easiest thing is to just kind of pick a high level concept where you're going to get about 78,000 patients. And then if you put in A1C, oops, if you put in A1C, you can find the hemoglobin A1C, which is this measure for patients with diabetes. And this is kind of what I showed you before. And if you wanted to find patients with poorly controlled diabetes, generally we say that's greater than or equal to 9. And so you can save that. And then you just click count patients. And you can see that right now we have 9,000 patients in the data set with poorly controlled hemoglobin A1C. And if we remove that criteria, you can also see that we have 80,000 diabetic patients. And so there's, you can name your queries over here so that you can keep better track of them. I have two sample queries that I did based on folks that the trials office asked me to try to model in TriNetX to get some counts. And we'll get to that in a second. But if I do diabetes and say ever had an A1C, like this, and then I get count of patients, I get back to my, so pretty much all my patients, oops, sorry, down here. All my patients, most of them have had an A1C. Then I can start to explore the cohort. So if I go into the this group of patients who have ever had an A1C, I can look at the age distribution as we talked about, and the age distribution and the gender balance. I can look at the actual other diagnoses that these people have. This is a subset of the 54,000 to speed things up, but 100% of the people obviously have a diagnosis of diabetes, but they also have lots of other things about them that are kind of interesting. You can look at procedures that they've had, medications that they've been given, lab tests that they've received, and then we don't have genomics or distribution, but those will be coming soon. So you can pretty quickly get a sense for the people that are in this cohort. And then if you go into analyze criteria, you can, and I'm just keeping this really simple so that we can be quick about it, but it says, you know, in our whole BMC network, we have over 1 million patients. 78,000 of them have meet criteria for the base population, which has diabetes. 54,000 have an A1C, and then if we had abnormal, it would funnel down. So you can pretty quickly look at how the definition of your cohort, as you get more and more layers filters down to the final result, and you can sort of understand the impact of each criteria and where you're losing patients. And then this is that rate of arrival thing, where you can see how patients come in and what you might expect over time. Right. All right, well, at least one thing has to go not working on a demo, but then you would see that graph like we saw before, where there's some variation and then it kind of levels out and becomes flat. And then the last thing I'll show you before we dive into the actual case studies of people who have put in requests is the analytics tool. And I'm not going to go into huge detail on this because I'm actually not expert enough to do a great demo. But the idea that you can analyze outcomes, so take a cohort and see what happens to that cohort, compare outcomes between two cohorts, compare cohorts, two different cohorts against each other, and to look at treatment pathways. So the way I tried to look at this, see if I can find this, is, you know what? I had one to demonstrate here, but I can't seem to find it, so I'm not going to go in there. But what I did was I created two cohorts in the same way that I did before. One was a cohort of men with diabetes who were over 18, and another was females with diabetes who were over 18. And in each group, I required that they each have a hemoglobin A1C. And then I was able to, in like 30 seconds, compare the average hemoglobin A1C on their most recent hemoglobin A1C between the two cohorts, and it even provided a t-test. And there was a substantial difference, but it wasn't statistically significant. So you can start to look at things like that easily and quickly, you know, and explore data and look for signals and potentially pathways for further research. I won't take the time to go to recreate those because somehow I seem to have lost them in the system, but it actually was pretty easy. The whole thing took less than 5 minutes to compare that data. And the other thing I'll show you is in the query builder, I showed you how you could do queries against Boston Medical Center, but you can also reach out to the entire TriNetX research group and use the same query. So if you redefine the denominator population and you run this, all of a sudden you have 2 million patients with diabetes who have had an A1C. There's also a COVID-specific research network within TriNetX. So the same aggregate tools that can be used for exploring data are available focused in on COVID. And the groups that are collaborating are slightly different. We initially joined the COVID research network to sort of pilot use of TriNetX, and then with our positive experience, we moved on to expand it to the research network. And then the Diamond network also includes claims data. I don't know too much about this yet, but there's some potentially interesting and richer data around claims in this data set. So you can pretty easily see how you could build cohorts against your local database to explore what you have available within your own community. But then if you wanted to broaden your scope to the whole country, there's a large and pretty rapidly growing group of collaborators all across the country. So let me just quickly go through a couple studies that I tried to, I'm going to get rid of all these ones that I just did and get back down to here where I can find the ones I did. But I was asked by the clinical trials office to look at two sets of inclusion and exclusion criteria and see what we could do in TriNetX. And so that's this list of criteria. So there was two studies investigators wanted to do, and I'll show you the narrative just to help orient you a little bit. So one was a study on cervical spine injuries in at BMC, and I think a potentially new therapeutic intervention. And so what they provided to the CTO was a list of eligibility criteria, which was great. And then there's embedded in here somewhere, there's the exclusion criteria as well. And so what I did, and this would be good for any strategy for trying to use data to identify cohorts. But one is to come out with as specific as possible a set of inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then to try to get to whether those data exist or don't exist in the EHR, and what types of data you might ask for if you needed it. That process will be helpful when you go to talk to the clinical data warehouse data analysts. It will also be helpful if you want to try to do this project yourself in TriNetX. And I'm personally thinking that if everyone tried to do some of this in TriNetX before they went to the clinical data warehouse, they would be much more savvy data consumers, and they could go there prepared and show the analysts how you're thinking and what you're thinking. But the first thing often that I do is to try to mark up the actual language to see what is measurable and what isn't measurable. So for this study, obviously they would require consent, but they're looking for males and females between the ages of 18 and 70. So that's pretty easy to measure, actually. They're very interested in finding a group of people who have acute traumatic cervical spine injuries. They really want them to be at the level of C4, C5, C6, or C7, and they don't want it to be at T2 or below. That's pretty specific, and you're probably not going to find that in a diagnosis list, but you certainly could find a diagnosis of cervical spine injury. And as I was looking, that was kind of the best I could come up with. And then they're interested in a whole bunch of other stuff that's pretty subtle, like a screening number, a grading system, MRI results. These are things in yellow that we wouldn't be able to clearly come out with, like no significant concomitant head injury. That's probably in the notes of the emergency room visit, but it's not going to be accessible through TriNetX. And then upper extremity muscle groups untested. So this is an exclusion criteria, that they're in a cast or they're in a wheelchair or they've had a previous injury or something like that. Those are things that you wouldn't know. Medically stable is a pretty hard concept to include. So, and it changes all the time. So even if you were stable, it doesn't mean you are stable. So that would be hard to measure. No known history of herpes, though, that's pretty measurable. And then you could definitely measure any diagnoses or problems associated with substance use in the past as well. We don't have very good allergy data, but we can look for drug exposures. And this drug I looked for, I couldn't find it at all. So, so some things you can measure and some things you can't measure. And but you know, in measuring what you can measure, you may actually get a sense for whether this would be a good site to do your project. And so when I looked at the cervical spine stuff, I actually found this ICD-10 code by Googling it. So when I put in cervical spine, this didn't come up, but when I actually put it into Google, I typed ICD-10 cervical spine injury, I got these codes and I was able to dig around a little bit and find them. But through a variety of searching, I was able to come up with an unspecified injury. So this would be any type of injury to your cervical spine. This, would be a pretty wide net to cast. You'd have to ask yourself, how much chart review you really want to get into. And then also I was able to find codes for these guys. But there aren't very many patients. There's only 180 who have ever come in with that exact ICD-10 code. So this type of searching can be tricky, but you can pretty quickly see that I was able to find unspecified codes. I was able to create a set of ORs that would put them in here. And then when I was up here, I was able to say, limit it to people who are 18 to 70 and include all sexes. And so that one I was able to model pretty well at that high level. But this would then get you to some idea of, well, there's 740. And then you can actually go into here to the event thing and start putting in time constraints. Like, when did these things have to happen? Did one of those things have to happen in the last year or maybe 3 years? And if you save that and run it again, you have 740 ever. But oh, I guess, okay. So then, and they've all occurred in the last 3 years. So that's promising. But, you know, you would start to think about this more and more, and you'd look and try different criteria. If you wanted to say that they never had herpes, which we saw, that was pretty easy to find. When I just went in here, I just included a lot of these different codes. And I was able to say that they should never have had one of these diagnoses. And then when I ran that, I only lost 10 patients. So 740 had the other criteria, and when I got rid of herpes, I got rid of that. And if I explored this cohort, I could start to it is going through like 2 billion rows of data, so that's pretty fast. I can look at the, you know, looks like it's much more common in males, so that's interesting. And compared to the overall population in our database, to me, there seems to be a predominance of Caucasian people with this phenotype as well. So, and you could play around with some of this other stuff too and get a sense for it. So this is just to highlight that this is not going to solve all your problems, but depending on how specific you can be, you can get closer and closer to the cohort that you really want. And then you're probably going to have to go do some chart review or something like that to figure out all that special nuance for that study. And then I can quickly just do this other one. This was a study that was interested in patients over 18 with reasonably controlled diabetes. So that's kind of underspecified, but later on down here, I found that they were using 12 as the cutoff. So so I used 12, and that they had some kind of diabetic foot ulcer, and they want a special type of ulcer that's pretty severe and potentially leading to osteomyelitis, which would be hard to get from the data, but it certainly would be pretty easy to get some sense for how many patients with diabetic foot ulcers come in regularly. They also wanted to include males and females, and they wanted type 1 and type 2 diabetes to be included. The location of the ulcer would be hard to find in TriNetX. A suspicion of osteomyelitis is pretty hard to find. Exclusion criteria of where it is on the foot was hard to find, but the A1C was pretty easy to use, as we've seen before. And then I was able to find these medications. I'm a pediatrician, so I don't know that much about diabetes. So, but I was able to put these in and do a little bit of a query around that. So just to show you quickly, what we came up for that is in the, this is all patients. So this one I pulled in diabetes, all kinds of diabetes. So to be in this cohort, you had to have ever had diabetes, and then you also have to have had, not that one, something about a foot ulcer. So this is not super specific, like it's getting close to your bone and you almost have osteomyelitis, but it is, it was pretty easy to find that. And you can find that there's, you know, large numbers of patients with some of these features for sure. And then in the in this section up here, I was able to define the over 18 years of age and any sex. And so when you count that up, you get that number. And then I was able to go a little bit deeper and say, exclude people who ever had an A1C greater than 12. It's not exactly right because you might currently be controlled, but this is your last one was over 12. And then also, or they've ever been on this canagliflozin or metformin. I put in the brand name and it came up as metformin. So that helped me find out that it was a common medicine actually that I knew about. So I could say, include patients with any of these things and exclude patients with these things. And then you can see that my cohort's getting smaller. So I had 6,000 before and now I'm down to 3,000. And if I look at that cohort, I should be able to explore that a little more and see what are some of the features of that cohort. And so this is the cohort of people who have ever had a foot ulcer, and the gender, the racial composition, the gender balance, and ethnicity is pretty weakly represented for us because our EHR hasn't historically collected ethnicity in a really consistent way. So it's generally helpful for knowing that someone's Hispanic, but it is pretty limited for sure. And then you could drill down here and look some more. So that's the system. It's actually not that complicated, but you can do this pretty phenomenal collection of queries. The one thing I did want to point out to everyone before I go, before I wrap up, is this help center. So there is a help center, and then there's a really great training center. They've created some pretty high quality online videos for TriNetX in general, Trial Connect, an introduction to the analytics component that I was talking about, and then some webinars here and some articles. So you can, once you have access to the TriNetX system, you can see these things. They're not on the generic internet. You need to be able to log in to see them, but there's some really nice stuff here, and the ability to do some self-learning, self-guided learning and stuff like that. So that's pretty much what I was going to talk about. I'll stay on at the end to take questions. Nicholas is helping us organize, at least for the initial wave, getting people signed up to use this. I do want to say, in all honesty and transparency, that this has not been widely used. So we want you to tell us if you're having issues, if some of the data looks strange. As part of our quality improvement process, we'd love to hear back from people. And so I would say, if you want to join this, contact Nicholas. I think if you're a BMC active researcher, you're pretty much good to go. You have to just sign one thing that has been approved by BMC Legal around how to use the system. And then once you're in, we encourage you to look at some of the training stuff. And then if you have active questions on anything, come back to us. And then if you're interested, if you're a BU user, which I think a bunch of you guys will be, let us know and we'll put you on the list to make sure we reach out once we have a better idea of how to organize access and use. And that's a little bit of a work in progress, but I don't think it's going to be a long work in progress. It's just ironing out specific details. So that's what I got. And we got a few minutes for questions if you have them. And we will also post this video somewhere connected to the clinical trials office, hopefully, so that others could watch it on their own time as well.
Yes, we'll make sure to share that when we follow up with the survey. For those that could not attend, we'll also send the hyperlink following that. It probably won't be at the same time, but we'll send another follow-up email to include the hyperlink of the recording. And then as far as how long does it take to get non-BMC people access, So that is a BU question, Bill. So Kimberly has asked for non-BMC folks.
Yes, I think I'm just putting the contact information in the chat too. So I think I don't know if Michelle's Michelle Eric